A weak, stupid, incompetent reactionary, who blocked progress towards a Western-style constitutional monarchy or republic. Such is the primitive Western stereotype of the much-slandered, and later martyred Tsar Nicholas II, whose only real fault was probably that he was too kind. In actual fact, the above widely repeated stereotype says very little about him, but far more about the hateful xenophobia, the hypocritical and self-justifying prejudices of those who hold it. What they are saying in reality is that the innocent Tsar, who opposed their Western materialist progress, had to be destroyed, however embarrassing to them the barbaric manner of his and his family's deaths. The remarkable thing is that this anti-Russian Western historiography coincides perfectly with both Soviet and pre-revolutionary anti-Orthodox historiography. Why? Simply because its writers have the same sources, in the same anti-Christian, materialist ideology, which developed in the West, and which the West has spread worldwide. What are some of these myths? Serfdom. Serfdom was not Russian. It was introduced from the West, together with absolutism, tyrannical monarchism. Serfdom was gradually introduced into Russia by Western rulers, or rulers with a Western mentality, notably the Emperor Peter I, and the German Empress Catherine II. It lasted only some 200 years, and was abolished peacefully, before the USA abolished its system of slavery. Only in the USA it took a dreadful war, and 500,000 dead, before slavery there could be abolished. As regards Western Europe, it should be added that in the 19th century, the condition of its agricultural workers and toiling industrial masses was little better than slavery. Tsar Nicholas's personality. Tsar Nicholas spoke 5 languages fluently. He had traveled the world and was very well acquainted with European history. To call him stupid or intellectually limited is absurd. True, he was not an intellectual, but then, has any intellectual ever made a great ruler? If he had been weak, he would have fallen to the stress of being Tsar, long before the First World War. If he had been weak, he would never have taken over the command of his armed forces from the incompetent, in August 1915. He was not incompetent, though many of the generals, ministers, aristocrats, and bureaucrats around him, including his Romanov cousins, certainly were incompetent, as well as being futile idlers. One of the Tsar's greatest problems here was finding disinterested, trustworthy and competent administrators. It was precisely the treachery of untrustworthy and incompetent careerists that brought about the Tsar's abdication. To call the Tsar reactionary is also absurd. For instance, it was he who, against all the advice, appointed the brilliant liberal Pyotr Stolypin as his prime minister. He taxed the rich and gave to the poor, turning peasants into landowners, much to the irritation of certain Romanov family members and other overwealthy aristocrats, who then plotted against the Tsar. The tragedy was that Stolypin was assassinated by a terrorist, after only 5 years at the helm, and before his reforms had obtained all the results required. Tsarina Alexandra's personality. The Tsarina was not hysterical, immoral, or pro-German. She identified fully with Orthodox Russia. Her alienation from decadent St. Petersburg society was precisely because she was moral. And having seen her kingdom of Hesse destroyed by Prussianism, she only had dislike for the German militarism that lay behind the Kaiser's war. She certainly suffered greatly with anguish at her son's condition, but as for hysterical, how could she have been, when she chose to wash and dress the wounds of soldiers, day in, day out, for 2 years? Khodynka. The quite unforeseen stampede of people at Kodinka Field, after the Tsar's coronation in 1896, in which many hundreds died, can hardly be blamed on the Tsar. Like recent stampedes in Western countries, it was a dreadful accident, causing the death of hundreds, in a then unprecedented crowd of 500,000. The compassionate Tsar gave the families of those who had suffered large sums of his own money in compensation. Pogroms. By far the worst anti-Jewish riots, pogroms, at the turn of the century, took place not in the Russian Empire, but in Berlin, Vienna, and elsewhere in Western Europe. Who has forgotten Dreyfus? In Russia, these riots were strongly discouraged, and involved small numbers in Poland, Bessarabia, and the western Ukraine. The Tsar's government did its utmost to defend the Jews of his empire, who had moved there, seeking protection from persecution in Western Europe. Thus, the Jews were kept away from large areas of Russia, for their own protection from peasants, who felt exploited and aggrieved by the successful commercial genius of the Jews. As we all know, it was not Russians who killed millions of Jews in the 1940s, but Western Europeans. And it should be said, not only Germans. The Russo-Japanese War. A belligerent, impatient, and imperialistic Japan attacked Russia without warning at Port Arthur in 1905, just as it attacked the USA without warning at Pearl Harbor in 1941. Russian unpreparedness came in part because it had spent so little on its armed forces, unlike the aggressive Western nations and their imitator, Japan. It was Tsar Nicholas who had proposed international disarmament at The Hague. To accuse this peacemaker of starting the war to create national unity is simply a myth of those who know no history. With only about a quarter of Western European and Japanese military spending, a peace-directed Russia was ill-equipped to fight a war thousands of miles from its capital. To blame the Tsar for Japanese aggression, or the disastrous inefficiency of individuals in his administration, before and during that war, is hardly just. Bloody Sunday. In the absence of the Tsar from St. Petersburg, because of the almost successful assassination attempt on him and his family 3 weeks before, a violent mob, and not peaceful and unarmed as the Western propaganda goes, burning and looting vehicles, and other property, revolted on Bloody Sunday, in 1905. It was led by a renegade, twice-married priest, Father George Gaporn, who hanged himself the next year, when it was discovered that he was in fact a secret agent. In order to defend the fearful citizens of St. Petersburg, troops opened fire, and tragically killed about 100 of the mob, not thousands as the Western propaganda goes. The soldiers had to open fire in defense of the people of St. Petersburg, who had barricaded themselves inside their homes from terror. The tragedy was that people died. Russia's alleged backwardness. Russia was not as backward as the Western media make out. In many respects, much of Western Europe and the USA were far more backward. In 20 years, under Tsar Nicholas II, the population of his realm increased from 123 million to 175 million. By 1913, the speed of industrial development in Russia had outstripped that of the USA. By 1913, its grain production had outstripped that of the USA, Canada, and Argentina, combined by 1/3. The Russian Empire had become the granary of Europe. Its grain production increased by 70% between 1894 and 1914. Between 1894 and 1913, its industrial production quadrupled. In 1914, the French economist Edmond Terry predicted that by 1950, Russia would dominate Europe politically, economically, and financially. Social insurance was introduced in 1912, and there was a factory inspectorate, but laws banning certain forms of exploitation had been passed for the first time in the world, as early as the 18th century, including introducing a maximum 10-hour day. 80% of the arable land was in the hands of the peasants by 1914, the Tsar himself freely giving up 40 million hectares of land in Siberia. So many tens of thousands of schools were opened, that by 1917, the level of literacy stood at 85%, comparable to that in the USA today. The Tsar's Russia was not destroyed because it was backward, but because it was the last bulwark of Christianity, and the materialist enemies of the gospel, capitalist or communist, could not tolerate that. World War I. The aim of the Western Allies was not only to defeat Germany. It was also to weaken and divide Russia. The West knew that with 30 more years of peace, Russia would become the most prosperous nation in the world. The West would not allow this. Thus, as soon as the Western organized revolution had taken place, in early 1917, the USA entered the war, and the American century began. By 1945, all of Western Europe had become the USA's puppets. This was no coincidence. The Tsar's loyalty to the Allies forbade him from making any separate peace. Sadly, his loyalty and sacrifices for the Allied cause was met by the Allies' disloyalty to him and his realm. What was remarkable about the outcome of the war was the treachery of the West. At the Tsar's abdication, Lloyd George actually said in Parliament that through it, Britain has achieved one of its major war aims. After the coup d'état of the Bolsheviks, who seized power from the incompetent aristocrats and bourgeoisie, who had carried out the revolution, the British landed in the far north, and at Baku in the far south of the Russian Empire, giving independence to Azerbaijan, as they were greedy for its oil. The Italians marched into Georgia, and created an independent state there, as they were greedy for its manganese. The French occupied Odessa, and intrigued for the independence of the Ukraine. Instead of equipping the whites, the West gave its arms to the Poles, who then invaded, and occupied Kiev and Smolensk. Then, the Americans and the Japanese landed in Vladivostok. The renegade General Brusilov, who had passed from white to red, remarked that the Poles are besieging Russian fortresses, with the help of the nations whom we rescued from certain defeat, at the beginning of the war. Even though he was a traitor to the Tsar, here he spoke the truth.
Based strictly on primary sources, the book The Romanov Royal Martyrs offers previously unpublished texts in English, from various archival sources. An impressive 512-page book, featuring more than 200 black and white photographs, and a 56-page full-color photo insert.